Everyone seems to have their own differing opinions on which foods are truly satiating and keep people full and satisfied. But what does the science say? Today I'm going over scientific studies on the most and least satiating foods, and I'll also get into effects related to carbs versus protein versus fats. Hey there, I'm Mish, and I am a full-time researcher with my PhD, and by day I conduct and publish studies of my own, whereas by night I share the results of other studies here to help you reach your weight loss, fitness, health, and nutrition goals. And for most of today's video, I will be going over specific food comparisons in terms of how satiating different foods are, which means how good they are at keeping you full and satisfied. And I think you'll be pretty shocked about what the studies show about the satiety of different foods. But first, for some background on why you'll be shocked. The big issue that gets talked about a lot in the scientific literature, but not nearly as much in public discussions about satiety, is the fact that energy density varies drastically between different macronutrients. And most notably, fat is more than twice the calories per gram as carbs and protein, which I think most people realize, but I think that fact is not getting factored into discussions about satiety. And I think a really important thing that's missing from most discussions of satiety is matching things for the number of calories. So for example, 2 tablespoons of butter is the same number of calories as an entire cup of pasta. And I think you could intuitively guess that a cup of pasta would be more satiating than 2 tablespoons of butter. Like, which dinner would you rather have, a cup of pasta or 2 tablespoons of butter, in terms of being able to feel full and satisfied after eating that dinner? However, instead, what ends up happening more in public discussions of satiety is people will say, well, a cup of butter fills me up more than a cup of pasta, so fat is more satiating. But no, you're eating 8 times the calories when you eat a cup of butter than when you eat a cup of pasta. So of course you are going to feel more satiated if you are eating way more calories, and especially if you're overeating or even gaining weight. And the average person is in fact gaining weight. And the fact that we intuitively tend to focus more on volume than calories when trying to equate different foods is probably one of the reasons why people tend to gain weight on the standard American or other high-fat diets and lose weight on low-fat diets, because it's much harder to get a ton of calories in or high energy dense foods when you're eating low-fat foods, whether they're carbs or protein. And you also get a similar confound arising in terms of energy density with a lot of high protein foods, because a lot of the most commonly eaten high protein foods also come packaged with a lot of fat. So what happens in terms of satiety when we put foods on a level playing field and actually equate the number of calories people are eating? Well, for the rest of this video, I will be going over scientific studies that directly test satiety and equate the number of calories among a bunch of different test foods. And to do this, they don't just ask people how satiated they feel, they actually look at the effects of satiety on how much people eat later. So how full and satisfied they actually are based on their actual behavior. And so for example, they would give one group 100 calories of apples and then see over the next several hours how much food they eat from a buffet that is loaded with all sorts of different kinds of foods, like a huge variety. And the only thing we're interested in is how many calories they eat from that buffet in the time after eating the apple, and how long it takes them to get hungry again after eating that apple, in terms of when they choose to start eating again. And so in addition to apples, of course, studies have looked at a ton of different foods, and they generally break them down into categories and then foods within the categories. And just to start with the categories that I imagine you aren't going to be too surprised about, the least satiating foods were the most highly processed ones on average. So things like snack foods and pastries and candy and breakfast cereals that are loaded with sugar and whatnot. And interestingly, a lot of the specific foods in these categories that were very unsatiating, or very low in the ability to keep you full and satisfied, were croissants and donuts and chips. So it wasn't just low-fat foods, it also included a lot of high-fat foods in these low satiating categories. But after that, the remaining categories are a lot more similar and kind of mixed up, so it gets a lot more nuanced in how we have to look at this. And now here's a chart with the foods that I imagine will be most relevant to you all. And for the specific numbers in this chart, I'm using the data from the big satiety index study that was really comprehensive and very widely cited that tested all these foods. And on the y-axis on the left, we have satiety index, where higher scores indicate that foods kept people full and satiated for longer, which means that people chose to eat less of a bunch of other food options after eating these specific foods. And right off the bat, we can see that the story is much more nuanced than just carbs versus protein versus fat. And I know I will get some questions about this, so just to be clear, I included every unprocessed, commonly eaten animal product that was tested in this big study. And there's another food that I haven't shown yet that beats all the others in satiety by a long shot. And I bet some of you can guess what it is. It's potatoes in a landslide. And as a reminder, these are all matched for the same number of calories. So out of the 38 foods that were tested in this really big study on satiety index, Potatoes won and kept people the most full and satisfied by quite a long shot. And now for some particularly interesting comparisons I want to draw your attention to. I'm focusing on these because they are completely the opposite of some very popular myths out there. And first, you will notice that potatoes and oatmeal and oranges and apples and pasta were all more satiating than a food that people often talk about as one of the most satiating possible foods, which is beef steaks. In fact, potatoes, oatmeal, oranges, apples, and pasta were also more satiating than eggs, cheese, and beans as well. Well, how could that happen? Everyone knows that high-protein foods are the most satiating, right? Well, as a reminder, we need to think about calorie density, because, for example, 100 calories of an apple is 3 times the volume of 100 calories of even lean steak. And that difference gets even larger when you start thinking about higher fat steaks or higher fat versions of these other foods. And for another myth that this data busts, you might notice that white rice and bran cereal are similar to cheese and eggs, and whole grain toast and baked beans were even better than cheese and eggs. So people who want a satiating breakfast and think that an egg and cheese omelet is the way to go would actually do slightly better eating all bran cereal or a slice of toast. Not to mention that apples and oranges are way better. And of course, the best combo of all, based on this data that was tested in this study, would be some healthy home fries with oatmeal. So for example, potatoes, maybe air fried or baked, probably not with oil if you want to keep the high satiating per calorie effects, along with some oatmeal. And interestingly, yogurt was one of the worst options for satiety that was tested, which I thought was pretty surprising. And overall, these studies are showing us that a lot of the most satiating foods are in fact low in protein, low in fat, and extremely high in carbs, pretty much pure carb foods. So I think a funny implication of this data is that the myth that carbs aren't satiating probably came about in part due to the fact that it's very hard to overeat on most high carbohydrate, low fat foods. So if you're truly eating low energy density foods, and you're not feeling full, then you're almost certainly going to lose weight. That's what the studies show. A lot of studies show that if you let people eat as many calories as they want until they feel full on high carb, low fat foods, they will lose weight. And on the flip side, it's easy to see how the myth that fat and protein are more satiating could come about, because volume per volume, fat and protein are going to make you feel a lot more full and satisfied, because you will be eating way more calories the vast majority of the time. And for a fact that I think is going to blow a lot of people's minds, it's well known in the scientific literature that fat is not actually that satiating. In fact, fat is less satiating than sugar. And I know some of you will be skeptical, so I'm going to read some fun quotes from a paper by the American Dietetic Association, and these quotes cite other empirical studies. So this is not just someone's opinion, because opinion doesn't really matter. So I'm going to read these quotes. For one, they said, their studies, in agreement with those of others, showed that high-fat foods have a weak effect on satiation and satiety compared with sucrose, aka sugar. And for another quote, they said, the fact that high-fat foods are more energy-dense, have a higher palatability, and have lower intrameal and intermeal satiety value helps explain why individuals tend to overconsume high-fat foods, a process termed passive overconsumption. AKA, they say that high-fat foods are energy-dense, really delicious, and they don't make you feel as full, so people tend to gain weight when they eat them, based on studies. And now for another quote on high-fat versus low-fat foods. Under normal, free-living conditions, fat contributes disproportionately to the energy density of the diet. And research has shown that when food is unrestricted, gains in body weight are greater when high-fat foods are consumed as compared with low-fat foods. AKA, people tend to gain more weight when eating high-fat foods versus low-fat foods, just living their standard lives. And if you find that the scientific research on satiety disagrees with your own experience, then I suggest checking out this video on how what you believe about the satiety of your food actually influences your hunger hormones. So it could be that believing the wrong things about satiety could be making foods less satiating than they would be otherwise. So definitely give that a watch if you haven't already. If you like my videos or find them useful, then please consider supporting me in making them, either through the Patreon, where I've got text summaries of every video with the key takeaways, as well as the ability to vote on topics and do Q&As, which is linked in the caption below. And then we also have the GoFundMe for more one-time support. I'm so grateful to all of you who support me, either through the Patreon or the GoFundMe, or your kind comments here. And as a fun fact, potatoes have been my favorite food for many, many years. I can just eat them plain and be very happy. And I figured it was just because I'm Irish, but I wonder if perhaps I had an intuitive sense ever since I was young that potatoes are extremely satiating and satisfying, not to mention delicious. And if you like this video, please like and share it so that other people can learn more about which foods are truly satiating. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell below to stay up to date on all this science. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.